Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel, Bursts of Sunshine. It's Ashley, and today I'm going to show you how I sew up a quick pair of bummies. I'm not going to say this is the exact right way to do it. This is just the way I do it, and I just thought I would show you guys. First, you're going to need a Bummie pattern. I like the Big Noggin Baby Bummie pattern, but also the Sew Like My Mom Pattaya Bummies is also very good, but this is just my preferred Bummie pattern of choice. They are completely different than the Sew Like My Mom ones, so just find a pattern that works for you. I printed this out, and then in order to get the size I want, I just laid out some wax paper or parchment paper, or you can even get tracing paper, and I lay it out on top of the sheets of paper that I printed from the pattern, and I traced out all of the pieces for the size I would need. I have the leg bands, the front, the back, and the waistband. So now that we have that done, we are going to use a stretchy fabric. I really like bullet or like double brushed poly, which is actually probably my preferred for bummies. They're both stretchy, they're both comfy, and they both work really great for bummies. So I'm going to get my cutting mat out and my scissors, and I'm also going to get my rotary cutter, which is my preferred cutting method. Mine's a little old and junky, and I need a new blade, so I do have to use the scissors as well. But if you have a decent one, you shouldn't need that. So as you see, we have a wrong side of fabric and we have a right side of fabric. So the ugly plain side that you don't want to see, I'm going to refer to that as the wrong side of the fabric for this tutorial. And then the pretty side that you want to be the outside of the bummie is going to be the right side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find out which way my fabric stretches. In most patterns, in my experience, the fabric needs to stretch horizontally, so side to side, and not up and down. There are some fabrics that are four-way stretch, but most that I have used have been one-way stretch, and so you want the stretch to go side to side, so that way the bands can stretch around the waist and around the legs. So as you can see, I have this little block here on the edge of my pattern piece. That usually means that you need to cut that on a fold, which as you can see, I'm going to fold the fabric over, and then I'm going to put that block on the fold, so I'm making sure to cut that piece on the fold. If you're new to sewing, I would definitely look up some YouTube videos on the basics, like how to cut on a fold and how to tell the stretch of your fabric and all of those things. But yeah, so I just put that on the fold there, and then I'm going to weigh my pattern down because they can shift really easy when you're cutting. So I just use this coaster I have. It's ceramic and I really like it, so I use it to weigh down my patterns. So now I'm just going to take my rotary cutter and I'm just going to cut through both layers of fabric because we do have it folded, so that is 2 layers thick, and I'm just going to use my rotary cutter and press down real hard to get through both pieces. And now we have our waistband. Now my rotary cutter, as I said, is not a great rotary cutter. It's kind of old, so I do have to go back with my scissors and kind of finish some of the cuts that didn't cut all the way through. But yeah, I'm just going to clean this up until I have my waistband cut out. I'm trying to do this in real time for the most part to show you guys exactly how I do the bummies. Again, you know, everyone does little things their own way, and usually when you buy patterns, they come with step-by-step picture tutorials to show you how to make things as well. Like this Bummie pattern that I have actually came with a picture tutorial step-by-step to tell you how to do it, but we all, I think, pick up our own tips and tricks as we go along. So yeah, and so now we have to cut out the other pattern pieces. I have here the Bummie back, and again, I always write on my patterns which way the stretch needs to go, which it's, like I said, most of the time horizontal, but it never hurts to write it down just in case. And so I'm going to fold over my fabric because, again, this is another piece that will be cut on a fold, and I just like to work from one end and work my way across. So again, here's my little fold. So I'm going to set that little piece on the fold, put my little coaster to weigh it down, and use my cutter and cut out this piece as well. Pretty much the same process I used to cut out the waistband, and we are going to do the same process for all of the pieces. Again, I tried not to fast forward this too much because I know sometimes I tend to go a little fast on things, and I wanted to make sure that this was something you could understand. Again, I'm going to take my scissors and I'm just going to trim off the pieces that didn't cut all the way through. I'm eventually going to get me some new blades for my rotary cutter. I just never remember it when I'm actually at the store, so in my experience, these bummies run true to size, and I never have any issues out of them cutting with this pattern specifically. I know I get that question a lot about if they run true to size, and in my opinion, they do. So now I'm going to show you about the leg bands. The leg bands, as you can see, definitely it is very important to make sure you cut properly on the stretch. And again, I am cutting along the stretch, but I guess I turned my camera angle so it looks like I'm cutting a different direction. I am not, as you can see on the right there, the salvage. Is it selvage? Salvage? I call it salvage. It's like the edge where you can see sometimes they'll have words on them or they'll have the colors. And on this particular fabric, it's got like little holes, like as if it had been stapled. And that's how I find the salvage. So that's usually on the horizontal ends of the fabric. If you have a fabric that has a print that needs to be a right side up, typically those are already made to where the right side up will be correct with the stretch. So because this doesn't need to be cut on a fold, I just lay it out and cut around the pattern. And I do this twice, but because we need 2 leg bands, obviously one for each leg. Again, taking my scissors, finishing to cut them out, and now we have our beautiful leg bands. And again, you could totally fold this pattern over if you wanted to and cut it on a fold, but I find these to be pretty easy just to cut around the whole little rectangle because it's a small piece. Sometimes these smaller pieces are harder for me to cut on folds. So again, once this is done, it's going to be folded over like this, but that's not how we're going to sew it. I just do that for the sake of, I don't know why I do that. I always set them aside like that. And I'm going to cut the last piece of my bummies, which is just the front of the bummies. So when you cut bummies, you have a front, a back, a waistband, and 2 leg bands. So if there's like a certain pattern or image you want on the front, ideally you would place it in this little space so you can make sure the front of the bummies look like what you are wanting them to. So again, putting my coaster on just to weigh it down, using my really sucky rotary cutter that I'm struggling with, as you can see, I am just going to cut through this. And now we have all of our pieces cut. We have the front, the back, the waistband, and the 2 leg bands. So I use the Brother Lock 1034D. It is a serger to do my bummies, and these are the settings I put it on, which is all 4s typically. But you totally do not have to use a serger if you do not have one. You can also use a sewing machine. Sometimes I use this Brother sewing machine, which mine is an XS 2100, and I just use a zigzag or stretch stitch. As you can see here, the 3 there with the looks like a little lightning bolt is the stretch stitch, but on my older, cheaper Brother, this was not a stitch option, and so when that is not a stitch option, I just use a regular zigzag stitch, to which I would use the 4. So I'm going to heat up my iron because I do like to iron my bands to give them like a memory fold. It's just kind of optional, and it's just something I prefer to do to make it easier for me. I'm also going to use pins, or you can buy these little like wonder clip things that keep you from poking holes in your fabric, but pins just are simple and easy, and that's just what I always use. I have this little fabric snipper. This is optional. I just like to use this little thing. And a seam ripper, just in case, because you never know if you're going to have an accident, have to cut some seams out. I've had to do it many, many times. And obviously your pattern pieces, and that is all we're going to need to get started. So I'm going to start by laying out the back piece first, and then I'm going to take the front piece and I'm going to lay it on top of the back piece with right sides together. So it's going to look like your bummies are inside out. Most of the time when you're sewing, your items will be inside out or right sides together. So that way all of the stitches are on the inside of the bummies. So I'm going to line my sides up here, and then I'm just going to use my pins to pin the sides together, so that way when I sew them, they stay in place. Now, you don't technically have to use pins if you didn't want to, if you just wanted to hold them in place, but my things slip and slide easily, especially with the double brush poly, which is a little more of a slick fabric. It can be easy to slip and slide, so I do like to pin mine just to hold it in place so I can make sure I stay on track. So here I am pinning my sides together. I just put 2 or 3. You can put however many or however little you feel like you need just to hold the fabric in place while you're doing your sewing. But keep in mind to always pull your pins out before you sew over them, especially when you're using a serger with a blade on, because it will chop that pin right in half and it could sling it somewhere dangerous. but you always pull your pins out. You do not want to sew over top of your pins. It can mess up your needles, and it's just a big no-no. Sorry if you can hear my daughter talking in the background. She's playing with a toy. So I got a little closer here so you could see how I do my pinning. Again, there's different ways you can pin it. Everybody has their own preferences. This is just the way I like to pin it, so I could easily slide it out as I'm sewing. So now I'm going to pin the little crotch area together as well. You just want to match the edges up and then pin it together so that way they stay lined up as you're sewing. I'm going to set this aside for now while I go ahead and pin up my bands. But first, before I pin my bands, I'm going to show you how I iron my memory crease. So when the bummies are done, they will be folded over like I'm showing you here, just so the fold kind of stays in place and it stays neat and flat. This is totally just a preference thing. It's not required, totally optional. It's just something I like to do, and it makes making the bands easier for me. So as you can see, I'm mostly just focusing on the edge because I really just want to make sure that crease is there. And once I have this done, this is the waistband. As you can see, I'm still able to open it up, and now I have this little crease kind of saved in there in the middle, which is going to make it easier for me later. So now I'm going to do the same thing with my leg bands. I am just going to fold them in half. I'm going to iron along the fold of these just to kind of, again, put that crease in there. And I'm telling you, it's just going to make it so much easier in the long run, but totally optional. Now that we have our little memory creases ironed into our bands, we are going to fold them and get them pinned and ready for sewing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open these folds back up that I just ironed, because again, I just did that to iron that crease in, and I'm going to flip these so that they are right sides together, matching the short ends. So as you can see, I'm going to flip it over like that. I'm going to match the ends up, and I'm going to pin them there because that is the part we are going to sew. So we are folding this the opposite direction that we folded it to iron the crease, because now we're doing our stitches. And there we have the leg bands pinned together, and we are going to do the same thing for the waistband. So we are going to unfold the fold that we made, and we are going to lay it out flat, and then we are going to fold it the opposite direction that we folded it to iron it, which is touching the short sides together, and then we are going to pin that together. I know this is kind of a long video, guys, but I'm just trying to go slow and show you guys the process of how I do everything step by step, just so you can get a good idea of how I do this. So I have my serger here, and again, you could totally do this on the sewing machine. It would pretty much be the same steps. Here are the settings that I use for the serger. I do like to turn this up a notch or two if I'm using a slick fabric like a double brush poly, but everything else I kind of leave at its standard settings. And now we are ready to rock and roll. So now what we're going to do is we're going to sew down all of the lines where we put pins. So all of the little edges where we put pins, that is where we are going to sew. So we have our leg bands, we have our waistband, and we have our bummies all ready to sew down these lines. Now, as far as seam allowance, this pattern only calls for a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but there are little notches on your sewing machine or your serger for how far you need to let the edge of the fabric meet in order to hit your seam allowance. This has a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but it really depends on what pattern you're using, on what seam allowance you need to use. Again, there should be little lines on your machine, and all you do is line the edge of the fabric up with those lines, depending on which one you need to be using to hit your seam allowance. I'm just sewing again through all of these pieces, going down the line where my pins are, making sure to pull my pins out before they reach the machine, because you do not want to sew through a pin, and with a serger you definitely do not want to cut through a pin because that can be very dangerous. So pull these out as you go. I'm just putting these aside until I get them all sewed, and then I will flip them the right side out. So again, here's the side of my bummies. I'm just going to take it and sew up the side. So we're going to do both sides and the crotch of the bummies. And again, if you're doing this on a sewing machine, just do the same thing. Just use a zigzag stitch and sew up all of the edges just as I'm doing. I do like to use my serger because it's faster and it gives like a nice clean edge, and it's still very stretchy. So I do like to use my serger for these, but you can totally use a sewing machine and then finish it with a serger if that's what you prefer. Now that I have all of these pieces sewn up, I'm going to flip my bummies right side out. So as you can see, the right sides are touching, which means it is inside out. So now we're going to flip it right side out, and there we have a look at what our bummies are going to look like. I'm going to set that aside, and I'm going to flip all of my items right side out. All of the bands are actually going to be folded in half. So as you can see, it's going to be folded over the same way we ironed it. So they're not going to be flipped completely right side out. They're going to be folded over and sandwiched in half, as you can see me doing here. So each band is going to be like 2 layers thick, and we're just going to fold it until the edges meet, which should line up with your creases perfectly because we folded it over that way already and we ironed the crease. So that crease should help you be able to fold these bands out exactly where they need to be. So now we have the waistband folded out with the edges meeting, and we are just going to do the same thing with our leg bands as we did with the waistband, just folding it in half so the edges meet and it's folded like a sandwich where the edges meet. Again, that crease should make this much easier to keep it lined up and to keep the edges lined up, because without the crease the fabric can easily roll too far. So I just find the crease to make things a little easier for me. But again, it's all personal preference. I'm not a professional, guys. This is just the way I like to do it, and it doesn't mean it's the correct way or the right way or the wrong way. It's just my way. And as you sew more, you will get your own ways of doing things. So the first thing I like to attach on this is the waistband because it is the easiest, just because it's one big band. So I'm going to quarter out the top of my bummies. To do that, I'm going to fold it in half, making sure the side seams meet each other. So as you can see, I'm going to take both of the side seams and I'm going to touch them together, and then I'm going to fold the bummies flat as if I was, like folding it like a piece of clothing. And so I'm going to pull that edge flat, and the very end there, that's going to be my front center of my bummies. And I'm going to put a pin in there just so I know exactly where my front center is. You can also put a tiny little clip in it with like some scissors, but the pins just always work for me. So now I'm going to, while still holding the side seams together, flatten out the back of the bummies, lining the edges up to where I can find the middle of the back of the bummies. So now here I have the middle of the back of the bummies, and I'm going to just pop a little needle in there so I can remember exactly where it is. So in some items, the side seams are not always a part of the quarters. In this case, with this size bummies I'm using, it did work out where the side seams were part of the quarters, but in some cases, the side seams are not perfectly even, and in that case, you would fold your 2 pins together like I just did, and then pin wherever the middle section is. But in this specific bummy that I'm doing, they perfectly even out to be part of my quarters. So now I've quartered the top of my bummy, and now we are going to quarter the band. So I'm going to start by taking my seam, and that is automatically going to be one of my quarters. So I'm going to just lay out the band flat, as you can see, and the complete opposite end of my seam there, that's another quarter. So we've got, well, pretty much it's like half and half. But as you can see, we have the seam, and then we have the complete opposite end, which is the other half. Now we are going to do the quarters by doing kind of the same method we did before. We're going to bring the part with the pin to the seam line, and that's just going to line up our 2 half pieces so we can find out what half of that is, if that makes sense. Guys, I feel like I'm doing a horrible job explaining this. So I'm going to line my pin up on the seam, flatten out my bummies, and there on the very end, boom, we have our quarters. So as you can see, I have a quarter here and a quarter here, and I'm going to stick my pins in them to hold them in place so I know exactly where my quarters are. Now, I like the seam to be on the back of my waistband, so that means the one I already pinned is going to be the front of the waistband, and the sides are obviously going to line up with the side seams of the waistband. So you need to keep that in mind when you are pinning this to your bummies, that if you want the seam to be in the back, you need to make sure to do the one opposite of it to be the front. So now that I have my band quartered out, I'm going to attach it to my bummies using the pins in the bummies and the pins in this to match up so they line up perfectly. This just makes sure that the band goes on evenly and perfectly around the bummies. So if you are using a fabric that has like a right side up, like if you have a directional fabric where something needs to be facing up, keep that in mind when you are doing this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my bummies with the right side out, and I'm going to slide them up inside of the band, as you can see there. So now with that up inside of the band, I want the edges to meet because that's where we're going to sew. We're going to sew the edges together. So I'm going to take the front pin of my bummies and the front pin from my quartered band, and I'm going to stack those right on top of each other so they line up. So now the front of my bummies and the front of my band are lined up together. I'm going to take one of the pins and I'm just going to pin them together. So now we have the front of the bummies pinned together. Keep in mind when you're doing this though, if you have a directional fabric and you need the characters to be facing upwards, keep that in mind as you're doing this, that this is going to be flipped up after it is sewn. So now I'm going to go around to the side, and I'm going to take the pin on the side of my band and I'm going to match it up with the side seam because that was the quarter mark on my bummies. And then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to pull my pin out and I'm just going to pin them together with the edges meeting. You want the edges to line up because that's where you're going to sew, is around the edges, and you just want them to line up perfectly so you don't have anything that's measured wrong. Now that I have this quartered pin matching my side seam, I'm going to pull my pin out and then I'm going to reinsert it through all of the fabric holding the bummies to the band. Again, rolling back around to the back, we have the seam here. That is the quartered mark for the back of the band. We're going to find the needle that marks the back of the bummie, and we are going to line it up with that seam. Now that those are lined up, I'm going to pull the needle out, and then I'm going to reinsert it through the bummie and the band, both holding them together. So this is just going to make the bummie so the band lines up with it perfectly, and you don't have to worry about some places getting too much stretch and some places not getting enough stretch, and then there being like big wrinkles and gathers in some places. This just makes sure that the band is distributed evenly around the bummie. So I'm going to take the pin and I'm going to place it in both of the fabrics, holding them together. Guys, I know I'm doing this very slow, but I'm really bad at explaining this, it seems. So I hope you guys are understanding what I'm telling you, or at least maybe the fact that I'm going super slow in the video is kind of helping. Finally, the last of the quarters, we're going to take the last side seam, match it up with the last pin in the bummie band that we used to quarter it, and the same thing, pull the edges together, take the pin and stick it through both fabrics to hold them together. Now that we have done that, we now have the band completely pinned to the bummies. Make sure the bummies are facing forward and the seam is on the back, because you don't know how many times I have sewn a pair of bummies and accidentally put the back of the waistband on the front of the bummies. It is not a fun thing to do. I've cried. I have cried over it. So now that we have this pinned together, we're going to go ahead and sew it up. Keep in mind your band is going to flip upwards once it's sewn. So now we are going to sew around the entire top of the bummie waistband where we've just pinned the band to the bummies. So I've got my serger back out, same settings, same seam allowance. It's all going to stay the same. It's pretty much going to be the same process we've used for sewing anything else we have sewn so far in this video. So I like to start on a side seam here, but you can totally start wherever you want. I just don't like starting in the back because sometimes at the end of the stitch it can leave a little bit of a lip kind of, and it can leave a little bit of a bump sometimes at the end of the stitch, and I don't like that to be in the back of the bummies. So I usually start at the side, but you can totally start wherever you want. So I'm going to remove my needle and I'm just going to start sewing. And you sometimes do have to stretch the band a little bit to make it fit the bummie. So don't stretch the bummie itself, just the band needs to stretch. So we're going to pull, what I do is I like to tug on the pin that I have, and it'll kind of straighten the band up to match the bummie. And then I'm just going to sew down the line, removing my pins as I go, making sure to keep the edges lined up together, because if one of these pieces of fabric slips out, you're going to have a hole or a gap in your bummies. So make sure that your waistband stays matched up with the top of the bummie, and just go down the line sewing while removing pins until you get all the way around the top of your waistband. Once I get to the top, I'm going to clip my threads, and I'm going to do my typical tucking move where I'm going to take a needle and I'm going to thread my little hanging stitch. This is like my go-to move when I have a thread hanging here. I don't want to cut it because then there's always a chance it could unravel. So what I like to do is I like to thread this little hanging off piece into a needle, and I'm just going to kind of sew it, not really sew it, I'm just kind of going to tuck it into some of my stitches. So I have just a regular sewing needle with that little chain threaded into it, and then I'm just going to stick my little needle into a couple of stitches going down my stitch line that I just stitched, and then I'm just going to pull the chain through. Once the chain is pulled through, I'm just going to trim off the excess, and that should keep your fabric from unraveling. I've heard of some people putting a spot of glue on it. Some people just clip them and go, but I like to make sure mine are secure, because if you clip it and go, you do have that chance that your threads could eventually unravel. Now that that is done, you can flip your waistband up, and as you can see, it is looking beautiful. We're coming along. We're making some progress. It's looking more like some bummies. And so now the next step is going to be to add the leg bands. But look how cute that looks with that little waistband on there. Now we're going to add the leg bands, which is pretty much the same process as the waistband, but no worries, I'm going to walk you through it anyways. What I like to do with the leg bands, I like to make sure the seam lands in the middle. So again, we're going to quarter these out the same way we quartered out the waistband, and we are going to take our seam. We're going to lay the band flat and put a needle in the little end opposite of the seam, and then we're going to fold them over together again, meeting the seam to the needle, and then we're going to stick needles in both of those ends. And sometimes I call the pins needles, guys. I mean my little sewing pins, not like needles. I mean, you can use whatever you've got, but I mean sewing pins when I'm saying this. I'm going to go ahead and quarter out both of my bands. Now, I have made bummies before where I didn't quarter them out and I just did half and half. I just found the line across from the seam and went that way about it, but sometimes it just doesn't line up just right. And so if you want to be like extra thorough, it's best to quarter it out, but you totally could get by with only doing the half marks. So as you can see, I already have my half marked there, and now I'm doing my quarters. I hope I'm explaining this good, because I feel like I'm doing a horrible job explaining exactly what I'm doing. As you can see there, I have it quartered, and the seam counts as one of the quarter marks. Now we're going to quarter the leg band the same way we quartered the waistband. I'm going to bring the seams together, and then I'm going to flatten out the edge of the bummie until I find the end, and that is going to be a quarter. I'm going to hold the seam together and go around the back, put the raw edges together, again finding the end, and there's another quarter. Now typically with the leg bands, the seams here are not quarter pieces. For the sake of making this easier, I am going to leave them at quarter pieces as if they are. So now, same process I did before, I'm going to put the leg band over the bummie. I'm just going to line up the front pins so they match up, edges of fabric together, and pin them together. I'm going to do that going all the way around, making sure that the seam of the band matches the seam of the crotch. I always just like my seams to be over in the crotch because it's the most hidden area, but you can put them on the edge or wherever you want the seam to be on the leg bands. Again, I'm going to the other side, and I'm going to take the side seam. I'm going to line it up with this quarter, and then I'm going to pin it together. Make sure your raw edges are facing down, not your folded edge. Your folded edge needs to be the top. The raw edge is what needs to be pinned. This is extremely important because you need that raw edge to be sewn shut when you sew it, and everywhere you pin is where you're going to sew. As you can see, I have my quartered leg band matched onto my quartered leg hole. and it is time to sew it together. I do like to sew this before I go ahead and attach the other band, just because sometimes the pins can get in my way if it's a small pair and the crotch is close together. On these, I typically start at the crotch because of the seams both land there. So I typically start my sewing on the leg bands on the crotch, but you can totally start these stitches wherever you want to start them. So again, I'm going to line the raw edges up into my machine, remove my pin, and then I'm just going to start sewing and go all the way around the leg band hole until I have the leg band attached to the bummies. Again, you might have to pull the band a little bit to match the bummie. I think with the leg bands, you don't have to pull them too much. But as you can see there, I did have a little bit of gap where the band wasn't big enough. So you do just have to tug it just slightly. Just tug on the band enough that it straightens out to match the bummie. Again, going all the way around, getting it sewed up until it is completely attached. Now, doing the same method I did before with the needle, I'm going to thread this chain into a regular sewing needle, and I'm just going to tuck that into my stitches and trim it off just to give it a clean, finished look. You don't want threads dangling on the inside. And then I'm going to fold out my leg band, and that is one leg band completely done. As you can see, what I was talking about before about how it folds down. So the part that you see when you're sewing it on is going to be the inside, almost like the wrong side of fabric. So now I'm just going to do the same process I did for the first leg with this second leg. So I'm probably going to speed this video up, but again, I'm just matching all of the quarter pieces, the quartered leg band to the quartered leg hole, and pinning them together with the raw edges touching each other. Go all the way around until you have this completely pinned together. Now that we have that pinned on, again, the same steps as before. We're going to stick it in our sewing machine. Again, I like to start in the crotch seam, but you can start it wherever you want. Pull out the pins and sew all the way around to attach the leg band to the bummies. Again, tucking and clipping your threads as we did on every other stitch before, making sure there are no threads hanging on the inside of your bummies. And that is it. You're done. Your bummies are complete. You can iron this out if you want to give it a more finished, pressed look. But in my experience, it doesn't much change how they wear. It might just make them look better at the end. But this is it. That's how you make your own bummies. You can make them in many different sizes because they sell them in all kinds of different sizes. I hope you guys liked this video. And if you did, give it a thumbs up. I hope you guys subscribe so you can see next time I post a new video, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.